This is the future.
Hello and welcome to the Alternate Futures podcast, where we chat with indie sci-fi creators about their work, the world, and anything in between or beyond. Today I'm here with Alan Doc Hansen. Alan is a lifelong fan of science fiction. He grew up in a small town in Utah where he devoured early science fiction writers such as Edgar Rice Burroughs, E. Doc Smith, and Robert Heinlein. He has recently completed his Orion Spur series with many of the characters inspired by his 5 children. Alan has degrees in Japanese, business, and higher education, and he loves to write and travel. Hi, Alan. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
So I always like to, I'm curious, to be honest, but I do start with travel quite often. But you have a degree in Japanese. Did that sort of influence some of your traveling? You've been to Japan then, have you?
I think so. I lived there for 2 years.
Okay.
And then I came back and got a degree in Japanese. And then I went and worked for the NSA as a Japanese linguist. Didn't like that. I would have retired from the same grade desk that I started at. And eventually went back and ran a training company that worked with the big Japanese corporations. So that was a fun first chapter. But yes, it did inspire a travel bug. We traveled a lot. We spent 6 weeks in Malaga last year.
Oh,
Or
wow.
no, early this year.
Nice. Yeah. So NSA, that's something we could delve into probably for a big chunk of a podcast. But what was that like?
Well, that was actually, there's a very interesting story with that. The director of the division I worked for was Japanese American, and he visited the university I was attending and had been talking to seniors, and I was a junior at the time. And he said, well, do you have any juniors that are getting close? And so I wound up talking with him. Very interesting man. We could spend an hour talking about him. He was part of the Rangers in Burma during World War II. But he's in the Ranger Hall of Fame. But he interviewed me. He liked me. Flew back to Baltimore, did some more interviewing, failed a lie detector test. They talked to me some more. I passed the lie detector test. Basically, every question they asked that was bad, I just twist and not. So I was guilty of everything. I should be in prison for life based on that lie detector test. And then I told them, I've still got a year of school left, and they did my background check, and then they made me a job offer and says, well, we want you to start in September. And I said, oh, whoa. I said, I still have 2 semesters of school before I graduate. So they set my start date at May 5th of 1976.
Okay.
And in October, took my wife out on our first date. We got married in April, drove back to Washington, D.C., stayed with some people we knew. And he says, wait, do they know your wife is a foreign nationalist? I said, what? He says, yeah, she's from Canada. I said, well, no. So I almost got fired my first day at work.
All right.
They decided manpower shortage area and gave me a waiver. So that was the start. I always called it the golf ball factory because they had a big rectangular building. They had the biggest computer in the world in the basement, which covered several blocks. And on top, they had 6 satellite dishes that were covered so they looked like golf balls. So I called it the golf ball factory.
That's very interesting because where I live, I'm 9 miles away from what most people consider to be a American spy base, Menwith Hill, and it's all looks like golf balls. It's like a series of golf balls, basically. So that's
That sounds familiar.
Yeah, interesting. So your bio does say you like to travel in the U.S. and abroad. So I was going to ask you, what was your favorite place to travel abroad, and then plug your own country, and what was your favorite place to travel in the U.S. as well?
Well, obviously, my favorite place overseas is Japan. I've climbed Mount Fuji. They've got Nikko, which is an amazing park. But that's a long time ago. Recently, we went to Bali last year, and that was very interesting. But I think this earlier this year when we spent 6 weeks in the Malaga area was fantastic. I mean, we'd take trains to see various cathedrals and historic sites, and I love history, so it was just after 6 weeks, I could have stayed 6 more weeks.
Yeah. What about in the US? What's your favorite place to travel there or to visit?
There are a couple I actually love Niagara Falls. It seems a little passe, but it's just so powerful and amazing.
Yeah.
So love that area. Uh, Boy, the Everglades and Key West were really fun. We went all the way through Key West to Everglades City, which we were informed was one of the primary cities. You probably never heard of Everglades City. Miami's on the, let's say, be the east coast of Florida at the bottom. Go all the way across the Everglades to the west coast to get to Everglades City. And it's just a little nothing town, but it's right where I think it's 10,000 islands is the area they call it, which is mangrove islands all over in the ocean. Fantastic, go through on a speedboat. One of the folks that ran the speedboat was one of the folks they talked about because they used to be the number one sourcing city for cocaine in the United States.
Oh, geez.
Because of all the islands, it was an easy area to smuggle cocaine into the U.S. through, and they get locals to meet their boats or however they were bringing them in, and then bring them back into the U.S. Problem was they were easy to catch.
Mm.
That turns out because once the DEA got wind of it, they just would go through the community and look for the people that had $50,000 boats and $50,000 trucks and say, okay, there's one.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, it was fantastic. We went out into the Everglades on an airboat with the Native American tribe that was in the Everglades. So a lot of fun. That was a great place, great trip.
You mentioned, well, your bio mentions you have a degree in higher education. Does that mean you were basically teaching teachers? Is that what that is?
No, higher education administration. I actually wound up as a dean of a college, and then later I was the vice president for online education in a division. That was an interesting story. The CEO wanted it, and the chief operating officer didn't. So he says, "What do you need?" I told him what I needed, and then the chief operating officer did everything she could to submarine the effort. But we grew it from about 160 students to 10,000 students full time online.
Wow. So how long ago was that then?
Oh, let's see. I finished in 2021.
Okay.
And if you want to talk politics, I could talk about that. Probably not, unless you want to talk about politics.
That might be for another episode. Yeah. So were you around with the growth of the, what were they called? The MOOCs, the massive online
Oh, MOOCs.
open courses or whatever they were.
Yeah. Yes, I'm familiar with MOOCs. If both ends of your internet connection are well suited to online and know what they're doing, MOOCs are great.
Hmm.
But we never used MOOCs. We used trying to think of the oh my goodness, I'm starting to lose the acronyms. The learning management
Oh, no.
LMS, learning management system.
All right. Okay.
Was more organized, so you'd build within the framework.
Right.
I had a group of at 60 full-time people developing courses, so we'd go through the whole curriculum every 3 years.
Wow. I think our school curriculums here only change every 7 years, so that's that's a good amount of revision.
If
Yeah.
that was interesting because I was in the early development, not the earliest development, but fairly early in online education development. And the big schools thought they had it because it'd create the curriculum, which you almost have to do in an online environment. And then they'd forget about it. So I remember seeing curriculum when I was 10, 15 years old because nobody thought to go back and rewrite it.
Right.
So,
so you've done all of those, NSA university type stuff. So what made it, and you were a big fan of science fiction, you said when you were younger. So what was the deciding factor that made you sort of move from reading science fiction into writing science fiction?
well, I will start by saying I love my mother, but I started writing my first science fiction novel when I was 12. And about 120 pages into it, she told me, "Why are you wasting your time?" And that kind of shut down my writing efforts, at least for writing books or novels for decades. But I had stories in my head I always wanted to tell. And I had heard the old writing adage, if you want to write, you need to write 10 pages a day. Now, I got a point where, I had time, and I would take my, one of the things that helped was these laptops, small, I can't remember the device now, but they're a little smaller than a laptop. And I'd take them to lunch and I'd start writing. And then I'd get excited about the story and I'd start writing in the evenings, and just had a lot of fun. And of course, using my own kids for character descriptions was really fun. Secondary character, well, not even secondary character. Main character is William Ryder, but the second most interesting character and easiest to write was his sister Debbie,
Right.
because Debbie believed she could do anything, and usually she could, but she overconfident, arrogant, but just extremely optimistic character. So she's really, in many ways, comic relief. In many ways, she becomes, as the storyline progresses, more and more important to the story. But yeah, she was easy. When I had other readers that knew the families, oh, I know who that is.
Okay. So she was based fairly closely off of one of your children then.
Her personality, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, the protagonist was based on my oldest son. In fact, there's early in the book, the story deals a lot with, in some ways, at different levels, bullying or people pushing others around.
Right.
And his approach to that evolves as the story progresses. But there's an incident where he was beaten to a pulp in a dance that is literally lifted from the actual experience.
Oh, wow.
So it's fun. Every now and then actual events get woven into the storyline, but it's a lot of fun. The most difficult one to write was his love interest, because it wasn't really based on any particular person.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the dance one then, because I was wondering why that was in there. But I mean, I could see the bullying part, but I mean, from my personal experience, I haven't really experienced something like that. So I see a lot of the bullying scenes from shows, and I think, that doesn't really feel realistic. But I mean, it's really interesting that you say it was based almost directly on something that actually happened then.
Oh, yes, very much so. He actually was attending a junior high dance toward the end of his junior high year, and he was very much a skater at the time. And in the school, there were very much the cowboys. And the cowboy, if you will, was also a black belt in karate.
Okay.
And my son was very low key. He was too smart for his own good. He was reading Russian literature in junior high, but kid pushed him, said, "I'm going to beat you up until you hit the ground." And he hit him once, and he went down so satisfied, and people laughed. And the guy started kicking with his cowboy boots, and he got suspended because he was beaten up so badly they were afraid it would cause other fights.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a real story. That actually happened.
Jeez. I guess I'm glad that it's beyond my experience. It's fairly horrendous. So did that the timing of that within your son's life, did that inspire sort of the type of book and the age of the protagonist in the book as well? Like, did you want to set that sort of fairly close and then take off from that? Is that what sort of set it at that age level?
Yes, when I actually originally started the book, I went through several editors, and they didn't like what I was doing with the front end, because I actually told it as a hindsight story told by his sister to his nephews and nieces. But I had to pull that. The last of the 5 books, it comes back in, but it's just too confusing for the reader. So I said, well, okay. So we pulled that out. But it was that inspired. I was looking for an adventure story. I mentioned I really liked Robert Heinlein when I was younger, and I liked his adventure stories a lot. And takes on a touch of Kidnapped and some of the other classics. I don't compare myself to the classic writers, but for inspiration, yes.
Yeah, I was gonna bring that up then, because you do mention inspiration from the classics, and the ones you mentioned typically considered, I think, the golden age of science fiction, weren't they? Does it feel in some way that we may have in the modern era now, in these like last decade, for example, lost some of the excitement and wonder that was captured in a lot of that sort of classic science fiction, even up into the
I
90s, perhaps.
I think so. It's hard for me to find writers that I really enjoy today. Louise McMaster Bugeaud is probably the most recent one that I really like to read. I'll often get off on some of the military sci-fi. There's very little what we call military science fiction in the first two books at all. There is some that comes in as the story progresses because of how the story arc falls. But it's more about avoiding a fight than being in the middle of one. So
Right.
that's kind of the. I did not want to write another dystopian novel. I feel like dystopia has reached or overwhelmed the science fiction market. I like optimistic stories, which takes you back to Robert Heinlein in
Right.
particular. His stories, especially his juvenile science fiction, was very optimistic.
Yeah, it's a bit strange too, doesn't it? Because I was thinking it's almost like we're losing our sense of wonder in the universe, and yet the research is uncovering more and more amazing things, and yet people are sort of just ignoring and sort of getting jaded and just sort of sitting in their own world, isn't it?
Oh yes, in the U.S. in particular, it's challenging. I was working with a developer in Southern Asia, and they had total upheaval in their country, and there wasn't a bit of news on it in the U.S.
Yeah.
It was more important that the dog got pulled out of a tree in national
Right.
news. I'm saying, what's going on? And I'm probably overeducated, but I look and see, there's more than just this little sector of the world, and it becomes introverted. There's canceling people, which is starting to become a little passe. But I find it interesting that people want to evaluate history based upon 2020 mores. I think that's silly.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, and I think with regards to the U.S., it really does feel like that is very. I mean, they're kind of doing it over here a little bit, but they're being really sort of attacked for it because I think we have a sort of broader sense of global history in a way. But yeah, with the U.S., it really I think highlights sort of some failings of the education system in a way, doesn't it? Sort of the narrow-minded, very American perspective means that
It
they literally exist in a bubble when contemplating history.
it has really gotten much worse. And of course, I have grandchildren who are in high school and finishing high school, and I'll ask them something that I would think anybody in the world would know, and they don't have a clue what I'm talking about, whether it be history or geography or what's going on in the world today. It seems more and more rare to find someone interested in that in the insulated world I live in. So, yeah, and the great thing for me was in 1971 living in Japan, which at that time was fifth highest standard of living in the world, and it felt to me like a third world country.
Hmm.
So I don't understand this. I've got to get a better understanding of what's going on in the globe.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I was just thinking with regards to the kids and their awareness of what's going on in the world. I mean, when I was a kid anyway, I remember in primary school, grade 4 and 5, 6, we had sort of weekly presentations where you had to present a news article and discuss it. And this was in primary school, like something that in England today would never be contemplated. And then they just kind of stopped that, and it seemed to have sort of just taken all interest in global events and even local news events away from any awareness of kids.
I think that's a little bit more, at least in this country, I think it's more tied into the teacher, him or herself. And, the insulated issues become more and more important. There are classes like I've got, they've got courses on current events and world geography, but it's not required. It's just something that some of the students will take.
Yeah, and that would be in high school probably level as well, wouldn't it?
That's high school.
Yeah.
That's high school. Elementary school, yes. It depends on how inspired the teachers are. My wife was a special ed teacher for a number of years. My daughter taught elementary school, and she would do stuff like that. In fact, we had this probably fun story is she had been teaching sixth grade, and she's really a literature person. In fact, the Rebecca Career person is really based on her
Okay.
because she's a bookworm. When we moved to another area, she prided herself that she could get through a whole school day and speak 7 words or less. That changed, but her first year there was like that. But she started teaching second grade. They moved her to second grade and says, Dad, I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know how to teach reading to second graders because I'm so much into literature. And I said, well, I'll help you. Because she was living in one state, I was living in another. So we started an adventure story where she had her second grade students and my second grade students and I lived on the moon. And it was basically a pen pal type relationship between the two worlds. And it was really fun. Very colorful, the caverns on the moon and floating in bubbles and things like that, written for second graders and just short elements writers, letter type things. But she had one of the brightest students in her class told her he was going to take apart his family satellite dish so he could actually communicate with us on the moon. So we had a really fun time with that storyline. But
Yeah, no,
it depends on the teacher. Also knew teachers that had worksheets that they wrote 25 years ago that they were still passing out and the kids weren't supposed to even look at them. Reminded me a little bit of the movie Teachers from years ago with, can't think of his name, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, no, I had some of those teachers when I was growing up as well. Just kept the same curriculum over and over and over and over till they retired.
Yep.
So the writing example you gave was interesting because it brings up something else I was thinking, which is that again, with regards to the wonder of the universe, there don't seem to be a lot of kids these days that want to be astronauts anymore. And this always saddens me because it really there's no sense, there really is no sense of wonder of looking forward. I don't know. Do you see the same thing? Have you witnessed that, or am I just maybe living in a pessimistic bubble?
I think it's real. I think the idea of becoming an astronaut isn't every kid's dream anymore, like it was back in back in the heyday in the late 60s. But I think another problem is the writing itself. What novel turned a movie isn't about how horrible it is if you go out into space. Monsters will get you, whether
Yeah.
real or imagined. It's all a terrible place. I don't see much in the way of optimism when it comes to science fiction today. Horror is easier to sell.
Yeah, I guess. And I think one of the big examples of that would probably be some of the new Star Trek in a way, from what I've heard. Anyway, I haven't really watched much, but Star Trek used to be an incredibly optimistic series.
Yes.
And from what I understand, some of the newer stuff is let's say darker and more pessimistic. And that sort of typifies I don't know, the zeitgeist, I suppose, doesn't it?
Star Trek had there's always an interesting juvenile book by Robert Heinlein. Can't think of the name right now. It's about a pair of twins that are engineers on the moon. They're kids. Rocket ship Galileo, and they decide to go sell bicycles on Mars with their spaceship. And they lifted something to. In the book, he writes this section. I think he called them tribbles, where they furry things that purr and they just reproduce incessantly. And then Star Trek had the trouble with tribbles,
Right.
which was similar. It's the same sort of feel to it. It's not horrible. It's kind of fun.
Yeah, no, it's interesting period we're going through. So I was wondering in terms of the creation of your books then. So you mentioned, of course, going back and forth to some editors to how much, well, what was the process there and where did you find the editors? Did you happen to know them or did you? Okay.
I'm very much a freestyle writer when I write. I'm getting old enough that I have to have outlines because I can't keep it all in my head anymore. I was recently listening. We moved Demeter and the whole series into Audible books.
Okay.
And so I've been listening to them all to make sure there are any errors. And had a great reader from New Zealand that did the whole series, and he's fantastic. But after listening to, I think it was Double Star, Heinlein book that I like, The reader was a well-known actor, and he was horrible.
Oh, jeez.
So it was good to have a great reader, but I spent more time on editing and prepping cover art and getting the book out there and not knowing how to market books than I did writing. The writing process for a book took me maybe 6, 7 months. The editing took a year or two. Trying to get the cover art, trying to get the thing to Audible books, I think it took us 3 years. And part of it was my own fault, and part of it was just the process. It was very awkward and challenging for me. So it wasn't my thing, which is interesting because I also have an MBA and have worked in business for 20 years, but the details on that eluded me.
Well, yeah, I was going to ask whether your business degree helped you with the books, selling your books and the book marketing and stuff.
Not at all. Not one iota.
Okay.
My thing was I basically most of my career was in turnaround management. So I'd go in and they'd have a company that was a mess, and then I would go in and fix it. And the funny thing is, I tell people my MBA was a nice piece of paper that said I am hereby bequeathed with this knowledge, but I really got my knowledge working for my dad. He was a great manager. He turned around his operation, and I was there watching it as a teenager, and I said, well, that's how you do it. So I would go in, and it was always about fixing the people. If you could fix the people, the business would thrive, and it did time after time after time. And I loved teaching, so I would teach at various schools wherever I happened to be. And one day I'm sitting there, and I get a call from a college, it's been a 2-year college, that said, hey, we're going to offer a 4-year business degree. We would like you to come and start up the program. And at the time, I was director of strategic planning for a company, and it was going to be a big pay cut. I talked to my wife and said, I turned around, I think, 4 different companies, and every single one of them within 5 years of my leaving don't exist anymore. And I said, that is a horrible legacy. When I teach, every once in a while I see the lights pop on in a student's eyes, and I know I've made a difference that's going to last. I said, I'd rather be in education. So I made that shift.
Right.
But yeah, business was all about finding the right people, keeping the people, not firing people, just relocating them to a position where they could thrive. And it worked for me.
Yeah. So, it's a bit tricky when your business has only one person in it, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It's a totally different animal, and it's a totally different enterprise. So I got involved with marketing, but it was throwing out ideas to marketing, not actually having to execute.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
Different world.
The different one, yeah. So, you're self-published. So, what was the easiest part of being self-published, apart from the writing? And then what was the hardest part? I think we kind of are getting an idea of that already, but
well, the hardest part's editing, because I don't like editing. And so I went through a line editor, and they came back and they said, we'll change all this. And I'd go back and I'd change most of it, but some of it's, I don't agree with them. And then I had it reviewed again, and they said, well, change all this. And it was kind of like writing a doctoral dissertation. Well, I wrote it that way last time. Now you're telling me that I need to change it. Now I need to change it back. And if I had to do it all over again, I would have taken the line editor's recommendations with a tremendous grain of salt. And of course, now you've got, I haven't gotten into AI other than as a faculty member who has to address whether or not we're going to accept AI generated work, and if so, how. But I haven't gotten into it on. So I suspect I would probably be better off with an AI telling me how I should change my lines.
Yeah, I mean, that was interesting because that reminds me of my own dissertation, which was I actually took that same approach because I realized fairly quickly that was going to happen. And so whenever my supervisor would give me suggestions on how to change something, if I didn't agree, I would leave it with the idea that if he suggested the same thing again, then I would change it. So it saved me.
I wish I had thought of that, because I think I had to rewrite a good chunk of my dissertation. Oh my goodness, 4 times.
Oh geez.
And on the 4th time, I was back. He was telling me to do exactly what I'd done when I started.
Yeah.
So I think it was more a matter of him understanding what I was saying rather than that it needed to be changed.
Yeah, exactly. Um, as we get on to your books, then I just wanted to ask. Well, actually, I wanted to ask two things coming up. First, how did you decide to use the moniker of Doc in your name?
Doc Smith.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay.
I have my PhD, and I liked Doc Smith. I actually didn't even know who Doc Smith was until I was in Japan. I have a great bookstore, Kinokuniya there. You can find all sorts of books that you would never find in a bookstore in the US anymore because they're all out of print. But they're in print over there, at least they were when I was living there. So I'd ravenously devour science fiction because I had an hour commute each way every day on the train. So yeah, I probably read a couple of hundred books a year at that point in time.
I don't. Since you brought up AI, and I like to talk about AI very briefly, did you guys make any decisions on accepting AI work from students or anything like
It's
that?
still, I teach for 2 universities right now online, and they are the consensus is it's a little bit like statistics because they made that shift when I was doing my PhD. Is you had old guard faculty members who would say, no, you need to crank all these numbers out by hand. And then you had, and when I say new guard, they were in their 60s.
Right.
The new guard was saying, look, you don't need to know how to crank these numbers. You need to know how to create the question, put it into the computer, and know how to read the feedback you're getting. That's what's important. Unfortunately for me, I got the new wave statistics faculties. I think AI is going to ultimately be the same thing. It's not a question of whether AI is good or bad. It's going to be a question of how it's used. If it helps you develop ideas or helps you find your resources and helps you figure out ways to put it, yeah, I think that's what's going to happen in the business world. Is they're going to say, okay, that's fine, as long as you're real careful with your documentation. My daughter actually works for a bot press company, and they're dealing with AI. And she loves to tell the story about the lawyer that got all of his information for his case, presented it, and he was disbarred because it turned out that AI will also create false information to a question. Sure, there's information. And so you've got to be able to look at your sources and make sure they're valid. So it's almost a whole new form of writing. And I'm old enough, I don't want to learn it.
Yeah. I do think one of the things is important is learning how to get the right information from the AI. And a lot of people are a bit lazy. They think of it as a bit of a quick cheat, and then they get burned because it just sort of makes up stuff or creates questionable links between information and things like that. Yeah. It is interesting in general, though, I think, how technology is changing the way we approach, I guess, asking and answering questions in a way, isn't it? Because as you said with the statisticians, so I was taking it was a course for parents on science for students. And one thing the guy who's teaching it was saying is that the way students approach information is changing because of the search engines. So he said they don't memorize things as readily anymore. They just sort of memorize how to find it, right? Or where they saw it last, and then they'll go there, kind of thing. Are you kind of seeing that sort of change, or that kind of sort of relate to what you're experiencing?
Oh, yes. Yeah, a lot. In fact, I have probably my brightest grandchild. Oh, none of the grandkids watch this. I actually work with him because he's really brilliant, but he doesn't know he's not consistent in his work. Mm-hmm. And so last year I was spending 3 nights a week with him working on his homework, and all I was doing was asking him questions. And that was clearly what I saw, is it's really a matter of how well you can use the search engines, and how well you can evaluate the sources. And we got into that a few times on some of the things he was researching. Okay, that's what it says. Now let's think about what does that mean, and does it make any sense?
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't think any of them are using libraries anymore, at least not the way we used them when we were young.
No, they've actually over here. So I'm in North Yorkshire, and they've revamped all the libraries. They're almost a hybrid community center now. So I remember
Mhm.
in my small town, the library was like rows and rows of books, narrow space between them. And now there's like wide open spaces, little bits of, and the library is actually constantly selling their fiction stock to make space, and it's going online. So they're buying access to ebook systems, which you can then use as part
Aggregators.
of a library member. Yeah.
Mhm.
So they're really just building community links and having a community space that has books in it, basically. So yeah, it's complete change. Yeah.
I think that's good perspective. We have a brand new library that was just built 5 miles from here, and it's 4 times bigger. In fact, it's in my hometown, which isn't that far away from here. And I went over to see it. And I remember the old librarian smelling the books, smelling the decaying books that I love to read, and went into this thing and said, "Well, 60% of this space is open space, exactly as you're describing it, which is fine. I think that's a good thing. What I do feel bad about, and I just did it with my books and put them into Audible books, is people don't pick up a book and read it anymore. So they want to listen to it as they're jogging or cycling or whatever else they might be doing. But they don't want to sit down in a corner and put their feet up by the fire and just read. So,
Yeah.
speak.
Everyone's too busy these days.
Yeah, we just did a 4,000-mile road trip, and I think we listened to 7 books while we were driving.
Yeah. Well, it does let you get through them that way. You wouldn't be able to do that otherwise, would you?
Yeah.
But it's interesting because I no longer like to really touch some of the paper of the books anymore. I don't know, it bothers my fingers. But so I like the ebooks. I prefer ebooks. But my daughter really loves the physical books, which is interesting because you'd think her generation would be much more digital. So I found that to be an interesting sort of falling back to a bit of traditionalism.
That ages me because I actually do curriculum development. And when I do, they'll say, well, here's an electronic copy. I said, if you want me to write this course, send me a hard copy. Because I'm going to flip the book
Yeah,
around and look at the chapters and the pictures and say, okay, now where does this make sense? How does it flow? Maybe I wouldn't do it so much with fiction, but yeah.
there's definitely a space for print books still in the market with that, specifically with that kind of. You can't do the same thing with ebooks as nearly as easily. So you have written a series of five. It's 5 books, I believe, Orion Spur series, and we've discussed a
Yes.
little bit of it, inspired by your children in some way. Um, Perhaps you could just give us a brief overview of the story before we get sort of into the discussion of it.
Okay. Well, we start with William Ryder, later becomes Ryder, and his experience. He's actually, as I mentioned, he's beaten up, and he's um, the girl he has a crush on, and his sister wound up kind of beating up the bully, in a matter of speaking, in the middle of the dance, basically taking him off of the rider. And as a result, they're all suspended. And the father and the I don't make the parents out to be bad guys in this case. They're actually positive characters. But father gets mad and says, I am not letting this kid go back to school here. And so they wind up transferring to a school for the gifted. And no, we're not going to spend a lot of time in the school for the gifted. It's a transition point where he meets this teacher, Miss Lee, and shortly thereafter, his favorite teacher from their school transfers over as well. And they're in a very small class, and they get into discussions about the galaxy and worlds might have populations and such. But they're also going on a trip to Europe. So they get invited to join this trip to Europe. So they're all excited. He actually talks his parents into letting his bratty sister go as well because she's in the school. And so this group of young people are heading out with their 2 teachers, and they get to O'Hare Airport. This is really odd. We're going to Europe for a year, but we can't bring our. There are plenty of breadcrumbs to say there's a problem coming up. So they get on the plane, and Rebecca Creer has flown to Europe before and says, "This is weird. This is not right. The seats are way too comfortable and too big, and it doesn't look right." And they get in the air, and ultimately they are actually being conscripted or kidnapped to go to this other world. There's a reason they're picked, but that's part of the mystery and storyline that goes with it. So they wind up being carried away to Demeter, which is a satellite that looks like a dead world, like a moon, but it has gates that you can go through, channel locks, and ultimately they are on the interior of Demeter, which is a terraformed world that's really cool. It's a nice looking world. It looks like, it doesn't look like Disneyland, but for a middle-aged person, you'd say, wow, I would love to go there. And Europe is a building rather than a continent. So they didn't lie to them. So they all basically says, you agreed to a year of service, you're going to do a year of service here. They each get various assignments they're working on, but we focus more or less on Sister Debbie and her friend Becky, Ryder and his upcoming girlfriend Cynthia, and then a little bit on the other characters as they develop. And I have been told I hadn't read the book, but and since I have seen the movie, but I haven't read the books by Orson Scott Card, Ender's Game.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
Ryder's character does remind me a lot of Ender in Ender's Game. His story goes a different direction, but it's similar sort of. Along with that, it turns out that some of them are kidnapped again later, but we have three distinct groups that we meet there, the aliens, if you will. Earth is kind of, I think there's an area in there where I describe Earth to this group as somewhat like India to the English of the 17th, 18th century. You know, they're people, they have skills, but they're not important to the overall world. But it's been going on for 600 plus years that people from Earth have been conscripted to go to this planetoid on a regular basis. So there's kind of an exchange, and they have a system to keep anybody on Earth from telling about it when they go home, but that's a different part of the story. Another group are the Corellians. The Corellians are much like the people from Earth. But they were further advanced. They already had more interstellar. They were approaching interstellar transportation when they met up with the Sagittarians. And why it's called Orion Spur is a smaller spiral in the galaxy between Perseus and Sagittarius, which are the other two groups. The Sagittarians are very militant in the first book. They currently control Demeter, but they've been at war with the Perseans for 10,000 years. This is standard role on the storyline. So the question is, how do you navigate between these two warring bodies, and is there a solution? Because the war is so long that nobody even remembers why it started. So we build into that. In the first book, we really are more into the character development, getting them to start growing and learning their roles. We have kidnapping, we get the mystery partially resolved, but we still don't know why people are trying to kill Ryder and his sister and really the whole group. So that's kind of your setup for the storyline.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting. You mentioned Ender's Game, because I was going to ask you if any of it was inspired by that. There's similarities with Ryder's character, but as you said, the story doesn't really revolve that way, other than his sort of character type, I guess.
It's his ability to be a game master,
right? Yeah.
Which becomes his role and his responsibility. In that sense, again, I hadn't read the books, which is kind of ironic because my wife is second cousin to Orson Scott Card.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The author of the book series. But we've never met him, but they are, maybe they're a little further away. They're cousins, they're not first or second cousins. So I thought, well, there's an irony. But so I intentionally didn't read the books when I heard that, because I hadn't finished the storyline. And then afterward, I did watch the movie, didn't read the books. And then I read the synopsis. Okay, there's a lot of similarity, but it's not the same story.
Right. Yeah. When was the first book of Orion Spur published then?
2014.
2014. Okay. Did you republish them recently, or not recently?
Yeah, they've just been republished because we were doing the audiobooks. So It was time to get them cleaned up a little bit.
Yeah.
weren't a lot of errors because we'd edited so many times, but I still said we were listening to on the book. So wait a minute, that couldn't. It's a very minor detail, but it was too late to fix it. And I said, I
Okay.
don't think anybody's going to notice, but somebody ultimately will notice. There's a character that has a minor character that has to be in two places at the same time for it to work. I said, can we fix that? Nah, we can't fix it at this point. We're too far gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I was just asking because often when I'm curious of the sort of the timeline of publishing for an author, and I check and if I see that several of the books were published like the same month of the same year, then I'm like, okay, they must have republished them from the
Yes.
original time.
Yeah. What's interesting is I have two other books I have written, but I finished the editing, but I've never taken them to publication yet because it's here. I got to figure out how to market these right before I publish them. I don't want to just put them out there and have them gather Ethernet dust.
Right. Yeah. Um, I was wondering, so I did read the first book of Orion Spur, and
Oh,
I
you
was
did?
wondering, it felt like a little bit because I have interviewed several authors who have started writing because they wanted to share certain information, certain ideas with their readers. One of them was, for example, cybersecurity type ideas. And you have a lot of information that you pack in sort of in regards to the galaxy in sort of the classroom settings at the beginning of the first book. And was that intentional for this particular reason, or was it purely just backstory information so that people could get a feeling of sort of the size of galaxy and things?
I thought it was for the reader to get a feeling for the size of the galaxy. I mean, it's important to the storyline, but it's also, you know, I don't know, you're not as old as I am, but I still remember there's no water anywhere else except Earth. There's no life anywhere in the galaxy except Earth. Uh, that always seemed odd to me. And
Mm.
so I started, and of course, I write on that a little bit, but I've written more on the water issue. And the more I write on the water issue, the more news stories come out about, oh, yeah, we've got oceans of water under this moon that's more than the water on the entire planet of Earth. And we've got water on the moon. We now have to know we've got 7 miles down, we've got a tremendous ocean of water on Mars. And that's it. That was the storyline I grew up with.
Yeah, it's amazing how much has changed since that period, isn't it? I mean, we start with just sort of starting to find planets, and you're like you said, back in the day, is really there's no other planets around any other stars, you don't think? And now it's like everywhere. It's just assumed, like you said in the book, that they're just basically on every star has more or less a planet or multiple planets. And like you say, with water, it's just everywhere, isn't it? Also, the building blocks of life we're finding pretty much everywhere, even floating in space in many cases. The
Oh,
fundamental
yes. Yeah,
structure.
it's there. It's
And we'll get into maybe some of those questions in the big questions near the end. I might come back to some of those. We'll see. So I was curious about your timeline and the idea. Well, a couple ideas coming into there. So you did again spend some time at the beginning a little bit sharing this, and you have a timeline of sort of a 10,000 year war, as you just mentioned. Um, but then you have the so a group then basically came to Earth 6,000 years ago, and well, maybe you can share sort of what happened, but I'm curious also why you picked particular that. Was that just to align with sort of what we're seeing with like the pyramids and the advent and sort of
yes,
civilization, and you didn't decide to go any further back just out of curiosity?
not in this case. Well, the idea was we have a group that wants to get out of this war, and they're a multicultural group, and they flee, and they've got a small fleet. Part of the fleet is wiped out, so when they get to Earth, they don't have the building blocks for a sustainable culture, and they basically disintegrate into what the population in the galaxy in this part of the galaxy is. It's just a warring group. So that was the foundation of that group. The Krillians, not quite the same. It's a population that crashes on a world that's not particularly favorable, but it is survivable. And they didn't lose 100% of the technology. They just lost most of it. So
All right. So did you imagine in the storyline then, is it that they kickstarted the evolution of human civilizations, or did they add in the technology? What was your sort of envisioning of that?
That's an interesting question because you'll notice none of the aliens are anything but humanoid.
Right.
I don't create reptilian creatures or uh, monsters in that nature. The monsters are inside the people in this case. So it creates an interesting question of whether or not the um, Sagittarians and Perseans go further back in evolution than they are aware of. I think there is a point, I don't know if it's in the first book, where it is addressed the issue of three different types of creatures, intelligent life creatures have evolved. I've got to remember what they were because it was more of a side point to make the issue that not every intelligent form in the universe has to be humanoid. But I know it was the gas giants and of course we've got dolphins that we talk about being more intelligent than humans, and of course Douglas Adams addressed that
Right.
question nicely. Uh, so basically, they've discovered three different forms of intelligent life, but the gas giant life forms have absolutely zero interest in communicating with other types of life than themselves. That's not pursued much further in the series. It's more of a let's make sure we clarify that this isn't the only life form you could possibly have.
Right. Fill in the world building as it is. Well, you mentioned a few dates. I'm curious. So you didn't try. So one thing, I'm just bringing the history part up because I've come recently interested in sort of, let's say, ancient prehistory history in a way. And maybe conspiracy theories, maybe more, who knows. So thinking of stuff like the Anunnaki from the Sumerian tablets and things like that. You didn't want to sort of go back into that any further, for example.
No, that was more setting. Plus, even what they're finding in the last year has been interesting because you got to ask yourself, okay, is this the pinnacle of mankind? Was there a pinnacle like this that's long before the most ancient records we have? Um, Fascinating potential storyline. I have one. I don't even know if I'm ever going to write it. But with the water on Mars being verified, I want to write a book called "You Mean I'm a Martian?"
Yeah,
Question mark.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so many ways to go nowadays. So many interesting, and a lot of it being ignored too by a lot of people, it seems. But that's perhaps something else to get into in another time. You did bring up something interesting, which is something that to me is also really sad. Is the destruction of let's say knowledge. And so you mentioned the Alexandrian library.
Oh yes.
Yeah, things like that. It does make you wonder, without sort of some of those knowledge repositories that have been destroyed, how much further ahead we could have been, how much we have lost from our own history, kind of things. It's quite sad, isn't it?
Yeah, and what's why I think equally as sad to me. I mean, Alexandria library burning. Just I said, oh my goodness, what did we lose?
Mm,
But and then some of the scientific methods that come out, or not methods, but some of the science are discovering that was in prehistoric times. Where did they get that knowledge from in the first place?
yeah, yeah,
Which just get touched on. But the other thing that to me that's equally sad is I see it happening all over again without having to burn down a library. Um, if you want to go dystopian, I really don't know what kind of society we would have if we had a sudden EMT and just wiped out all electronic and technical knowledge that's there. Where would we start? The
yeah.
sky
We
the
have
limit.
kind of reached a level of dependency, haven't we? It seems.
Extreme dependency.
Yeah,
Uh, so yeah, like you mentioned, we no longer memorize stuff. We just know where to find it, which works great as long as it's there to be found.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, it's I mean that whole historical thing, because I'm very interested in the cycles as well, and like you say, it all sort of suggests previous cycles. And then you wonder, like we still don't know how they built the pyramids, and you wonder, okay, the people who are making the stories about history, they're not people with scientific knowledge, for example, or engineering knowledge. They're people who are piecing together stuff from books and from archaeological digs, but without a certain perhaps key aspect of their knowledge. And so it only becomes sort of solvable when you get the right people starting to look into this, which is only sort of becoming recent, I think.
Then you've got the question: is the scientific knowledge they have that they're making their analysis with valid science?
Yeah, or complete enough to understand it. Yeah.
Yeah, the science. I mean, again, I'm getting old enough where I look back and say, well, this is the way science saw it 60 years ago. And now we're saying, well, none of that was right. Well, it's not none of that. Much of that was not right. And what I find interesting is now the scientific theory from 10 years ago is being debunked with new knowledge and new understanding. So, well, now it's this. I said, I don't know what it's going to look like 100 years from now, but it won't look like it looks like today.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit off topic, but it is concerning even more deeply than that. So I was a scientist in my previous life, let's say, like 20 years ago. And and what I've seen since then in science is a kind of corruption that's entered the system, not the people, but the system. And so we've seen sort of a corrupt politicization of science within the last, let's say, a few years. But worse than that, behind the scenes is let's say a commercialization of science, and then almost a commodification. So you have the journals, who are supposed to be sort of the presenters of the truth. So you have the peer review, right? But then you get predatory journals, which will publish stuff if you pay them, and they have their own board that peer reviews, so it doesn't even go to proper peer review. And then you've got, for example, in China, it's well known that you've got some of the people will buy time on like a paper farm, let's say. So it'll actually generate articles for them that don't even have any data behind it. It makes everything up, and then they publish them, right? Just in order to pad their CV. And all of this together is basically the last 15 years. And it's there's a website called Retraction Watch, and each month there's hundreds of papers that are being retracted from the journals, and you're just like, this is not good for science. And this is not good for science, and it's not good for trust in science.
Yeah, I've been a peer reviewer before, and it's you're always looking to make sure it's something new and that it's legit, but that depends on the type of journal you're publishing to. So
yeah, I mean, when it runs properly, it's a good system. Unfortunately, it seems to have been corrupted and co-opted in many ways. I mean, there is still, I'm not saying there's not still good science happening, but it's getting buried amongst all the, let's say, junk science and politicized science now. It's very disturbing to me as a former scientist. Just, I think it's very dangerous too, because we just don't really know what's going on anymore. But maybe that's a little rant I went off on there. I was wondering then, how much time did you spend on the, let's say, the cosmic world building of Orion Spur?
It would have been weeks, not years. And that's, again, 2014 is when the first one was published. The World of Demeter. I started with Ceres in the asteroid belt. So what would happen if? And then I started working that through that process. The book, and of course, studying the three arms of the galaxy to get a good sense of our setting, so that it makes some sort of sense. There's some issues toward in the last book that every now and then I go back now and I said, okay, relative to timelines for transportation, is that even possible? And I think it's okay, but I would hate to sit down with a ledger and say, okay, you went that far this time, because not like Star Trek, you don't get instantly to the next destination,
right?
Or for that matter, I guess. But yeah, it's instantaneous. So there's transportation issues, and how did that work? The third or the fourth book, I actually leave Demeter finally, and they go into an asteroid belt universe, and that took a while to put together. So how is that going to work? What are the problems with that? How are we going? You know, you can't just say, okay, well, I'm going there, and that's going to happen. Now, how are we going to get there, and what are the problems we're going to face? And I do, when I write, try and make it within the realm of the storyline, uh, realistic. So, okay, you want to get there, but you can't get there directly, because if you go there directly, you have to pass this. Can you pass this? No, you can't pass this. So how would you get there? And so really not hundreds of hours on building the world, but letting the world in many ways evolve as the story progressed. I've been a little surprised listening to books again at this point. And, I'm my own fan. I actually can listen to the story. There's some books, again, a lot of Heinlein stuff I can listen to over and over again. Some I can read one and done. Asimov, I love to read Asimov once. But I don't want to go back and read his technical books twice. So, the evolution. There are times when I'm writing the story where I say, okay, what should happen next? And then I go back, and I've gone back to the storyline now, and I'm listening. And so much of the subplots and things come together. I said, my brain couldn't do that today, because it has closure on a lot of the sub issues. And I didn't even think about it when I was writing it.
Yeah, I've found something like similar to that as I started writing myself, I don't know, maybe around the same time you did. But I sort of diverged in my path. I went into sort of other aspects of publishing, for example. But I come back and I sort of go read some of the stuff I wrote then, and I'm like, wow, I don't know. Can I still do that? Can my brain work that way anymore? I don't know.
I think for me to write something like that again, I would have to work from a very serious outline, which is kind of disappointing, because a lot of times I'll get to it and I'll start laughing because it's so funny what just happened, or start kind of tearing up because, well, that's so sad. I said, yeah, but that's where the story has to go.
Yeah. Did you happen to write in any of the NaNoWriMos, the National Novel Writing Months, to sort of inspire you to write forward? Because I found
No,
that
I have not.
useful.
I've got a good friend that does, and I've always thought about, I think isn't it in September,
November, yeah.
November? Oh, now you're going to tempt me, because I've got two stories I do want to write, and I've outlined them. Oh, it wouldn't be fair, because I think I've written the first four chapters of the first one. So no,
Well,
not
it's
that
much
one.
more flexible now. You can actually sign up and make your own goals if you want, or you can do the classic version. But yeah, I always found them, um, I guess, creatively inspiring, because you're in such a hurry to you want to get the stuff down, and you hit a bit of a roadblock, and so you don't really have time to dwell on the roadblock. You just gotta blast around it or through it however you can. So you just come up with crazy ideas to get your story going forward. Yeah, it's
Okay.
quite fun. Yeah. Um, yeah, I was curious. So specifically on the world building of Orion Spur, because one of the things that was curious to me is the distances involved, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I mean, did you sort of envision the let's say Sagittarian and Persian empires kind of meeting at that point? Is that how you sort of saw it? I mean,
Yeah,
how
what you've
far
got
away
is
are
you've
they?
got, well, there's a real interesting aspect of this that I do address throughout, especially as the books progress, is what have you taken away so you can fight over this turf that really isn't that important to you anyway? Neither one of the cultures has expanded throughout their own arm of the galaxy. Instead, they've diverted their resources to fight over this bone. And a lot of it ties into their own honor and perspective of what must be, but they aren't really in need of the Orion Spur. There are plenty of stars and planets to explore in their own region, but they wandered into the Orion Spur and then argued over whose bone it was.
Yeah, that's without wanting to delve too politically, that does sort of sound reminiscent of a certain country at the moment in the Eastern Europe that's being fought over. by two big powers, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Well,
But
and I mean, historically, that's happened over and over again.
yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, because you just think, I mean, just thinking on what you said there about the resources, the amount of money being thrown into that conflict that could go to much better uses
Yes.
is just mind-boggling. It's hard to even fathom, basically, but the good that could come from that kind of resources being thrown to something useful. So yeah, you've captured an excellent part of the political system, I guess, within your conflict. Um, so one thing I noticed in Orion Spur is I didn't recognize any AI in there. Was that intentional, or you just didn't feel a need to put it in?
Well, keep in mind, I started writing this before AI was a thing.
Right. So it wasn't really on
So
your radar.
it wasn't really on my radar.
So when you go back now, do you ever think do you ever question yourself on how some of the technologies might have evolved now, knowing what you know now about our technology?
Yes. Yeah. I've been listening to the books over again, and I'm saying, wow, this is getting just a hair dated, but not too bad. I actually have been relatively pleased with that aspect of it because that's not the point of the story. The story is about the people and how they evolve and grow. And of course, they've got problems they're trying to solve. That's if you don't have that, you don't have opposition, you don't have a story to write. But I really, particularly some of the secondary characters, and I think about like Randy and Joel Porter, since you've read the first one. Um, they're secondary characters, and they're clearly secondary characters in the first book. But since it's a 5-book series, as the story evolves, you start seeing how those characters are evolving and changing, which makes it feel to me a much richer and fuller story. So, but there's only so many pages you can put into a first book. I guess I could have made it longer just to fill with filler pages, but that wouldn't make me happy. So,
Yeah. Do you have plans? Because a story like this, with the world building as you've done it, I mean, obviously opens up a lot of other possibilities. And have you I mean, they could be, possibilities for backstory in the past, or possibilities within each of the empires moving forward, or even, their stories. Have you thought to start on other things in this series?
I have. I made it. I made it. As I was writing, when I first started, I thought it was going to be a 3-book series, and I got partway into the second book, and I could see the whole story, and it's going to take me 5 books to tell the story. But it has a fairly clear beginning. It has a very clear ending, and the ending establishes where it can go. Now, in the ending, I told you I brought back the sister telling the story to the nephews. The nephews and nieces wind up going with her. So yeah, I could spin it off that way. There's still an antagonist in there that hasn't been fully resolved. I have written a couple of short stories relative. The Debbie character is so much fun that I have thought, particularly of going back, and there's a gap in years between the ending of the initial story and where she's telling the story in book 5. So there's a wealth of story I could put in there. And the way the publishers are today, they would probably much more appreciate a female protagonist. But it's, I don't know, I felt like the story was complete. So going back there, I would have to really have, okay, it's great, I can do that, but what's the story?
Yeah, I guess what I was thinking is not so much building on that main book of 5, but extra series within that universe, I suppose.
Mhm.
Is what. But yeah, it was interesting what you mentioned with the Debbie character, because as I was reading it, I thought it feels like he wants to write Debbie as the protagonist rather than Ryder in a lot of places. And I thought,
I think of
well,
her much more as I think of her in the first book, especially more as comic relief.
that's interesting, because she seemed in many ways
So,
to be, like, as you said, the more energetic one, the more pushing forward, with her drive to be the
oh
pilot
yes,
and everything. Yeah.
pushing the boundaries. Yeah,
Yeah.
she would be a great protagonist if I were going to write more, and I've thought about it, would be focusing on her character as the protagonist. And I guess it's a good thing. She also has some interesting flaws. So that overconfidence could catch her.
I guess on that note, we should move into the big questions because we are getting on in our time. So I just give you a few big questions here before the end, which are related to the themes from your story. And we sort of, I guess, touched on maybe some of them, but we'll see. So let's say the nature of your story, the first big question then, and especially book one, at least part that I took away, which we've touched on with the past, in some ways addresses the Fermi paradox as part of a backstory, which is if intelligent extraterrestrial species exist, where are they, right? And there are many possible solutions to the paradox, but I was going to ask you, what do you think the most reasonable one is as to why we don't see them?
If you were a much more intelligent person than you and I are, if you were that type of person and you had studied the people of Earth, would you really want to get to know them up close and personal? There are stories and books that have been written about this. Some going clear back to the early ages of science fiction is usually the escape valve is love, but everything else about human nature is do they deserve to exist? So right. I think I would be surprised if we have that developed a culture or society or alien life form that has the ability to travel here and back without extreme, excruciating suffering, like taking 4 lifetimes to go each way. I don't know if I would introduce myself to you or not.
Right. So the question of, they just don't want us to know about them, basically.
I think you could go
more advanced. Yeah.
Wasn't that one of the storylines of Star Trek of how the Vulcans studied Earth and finally came to a point where they said, well, okay, we think they're evolved enough to be introduced to or introduce ourselves to them. I think that was one of the lines on one of the series. I think I saw 1 or 2 episodes of and said, oh, okay.
Yeah.
I can see that.
So what I was wondering, because one thing that's brought up is the time, of course, right? The millions and hundreds of millions of years. If a civilization, even an intelligent civilization, went spacefaring 1 million years ago, the blink of an eye in the galaxy, they could potentially cover the entire galaxy by now, especially if they went with AI robots. So would you think that the fact that we don't see AI robots floating around, at least obviously, might suggest the possibility that self-aware machine intelligence is not possible, maybe? I'm extrapolating.
I don't know. that's I think the last thing I read on that said we were, was it 30 or 40 years away from that, of integrating AI with human intelligence. The way knowledge has expanded, it's hard for me to not fathom it being possible. An interesting question is, are they going to say, well, humans are parasites, so we need to wipe them out? Or is it going to be something where the intelligent life is a slave to humanity? And if it's got its own ability to think, should it be? I don't know.
Right. Yeah. I don't remember who it was now, but I did interview someone who has a series of books where the self-aware AIs are kept captive by the inventor of them, basically. Yeah. Of course, it goes terribly wrong in the end, but do you...
That was an interesting, more positive movie on that, which was based on, I think it was an Asimov novel. I can't remember. Bicentennial Man.
Oh, okay. All right.
Robin Williams, where the one robot gradually evolves over a period of a couple of 100 years. So,
yeah,
of course, then you have that trap as well. But that had an interesting and somewhat optimistic perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting, the timeline, because with the current AIs, although they're not obviously I won't say obviously, they don't appear to be self-aware. But in terms of the amount of processing and learning they can do, So one estimate was that they can learn about, let's say, I think it was 200 years worth of human learning in about 2 weeks. Just to give you a scale of how fast they would advance if they if they did become self-aware.
I
I was
wonder when they
wondering.
would become bored.
Well, I guess it depends how quickly they. Yeah, it would definitely inspire them to get out into the galaxy a lot faster, wouldn't it?
Yes.
Do you think it's important for stories that have extraterrestrials to kind of address this, the Fermi paradox, or do you think it's fine to sort of ignore it for the flow of the story, let's say?
I feel like, of course, I address it in Demeter, where
Right.
it's addressed in a manner of, yeah, they're here, but they're not. And of course, there are a lot of horror stories that have been used that premise before. But I think the story is the most important part. It's all about the characters. Do they have to be in a science fiction novel? Could they be in a pirate story or summer story? I think the science fiction for me is the setting. And of course, I like the adventure aspects of it. What adventure is left for us here on Earth now? There was still some 60 years ago, but it's getting less and less. So if you want adventure, you're going to have to move beyond the bounds of Terra in order to experience it. So, yeah, for me, it's more the characters.
Yeah. That's that.
Technology, but it's more character driven.
And again, the adventure is getting more restricted as well, I think. The opportunity to go for adventure. Um, Closely related to the Fermi paradox, then, is the Drake equation in some ways, which is intended to provide a form. It's like it's a ways old, but a formula for estimating the number of intelligent species in the galaxy. I mean, at the time that it was created, we were the
Uh-huh.
only planet we were the only solar system they knew of. But now that we know there's stars like everywhere, how many independently evolved intelligent? Because you sort of suggest a little bit of panspermia in your backstory, but how many
Oh, yes.
independently evolved intelligent species do you think there might currently exist in our galaxy? And I'll let you just sort of ballpark it. Obviously, I'm not going to give you a point it to a number or anything.
Well, you got the one limitation you got to consider is what is an intelligent form of life? I mean, you just talked about AI being potentially intelligent form of existence. Um, if we go, I would probably pick my number based upon the Goldilocks principle and say, okay, how many planets do we have in that range? And if we got the math, estimated math on that, I would say intelligent life, 1 in 200, that's evolved to the point where you could communicate with them. Now, to being spacefaring, I don't know. I can picture intelligent life that didn't care.
Yeah.
Uh, so they're in their own United States and don't care what's going on around in the rest of the universe. So
Yeah, that's a lot of us on this planet, isn't it? So, well, not us, but a lot of
yeah,
people on this
so
planet.
did
Yeah.
they get the desire? And what I think another interesting aspect, we had the moon, and the moon was something you could potentially achieve. If you got a Goldilocks planet and there's no moon within any distance or planets within distance, why would you go into space? That would be another interesting question. Versus another one set up more like Mars, where you've got two moons that are relatively close. That would encourage you to try and get there and find out more about it. So I think you
Yeah.
got a lot of to find that.
Yeah, there's an interesting idea that if the planet is too Goldilocks, there might not be a reason to leave. Whether it's too nice. Um, Something I've always wondered about is what happens if, let's say, so we have, like you said, the Earth and the Moon. The Moon obviously is pretty barren, but let's say that you had two that were closer, or that you had a second planetoid that had an atmosphere and life on it. It would seem to me that that would be really inspiring for people on either one to want to go to the other one,
Mm-hmm.
and hence develop space travel much faster.
Yeah, especially if you start having radio communication back and forth.
Yeah, exactly. Um, so and again, so how relevant do you think this would be to sort of panspermia, the idea that a species might then initiate life similar to itself, or um, uplift, I suppose would be the term, other organisms on life. So in other words, one species goes out into space and then starts spreading itself or something like itself around.
I would think if you follow the storyline that says we've got this many millions of years left before Earth is no longer habitable, or if you say follow a different model and say it's a few hundred years or even less, then I think that notion of how do we continue our species, that's deep inside of each and every one of us. So my perspective would be yes, let us assume there is no way to go beyond the speed of light. Then you're looking at cultures traveling with their populations to habit other planets. Now, how are they going to get to the point where they decide where they're going? Well, we've got the James Webb Telescope now. Who says somebody doesn't have something much better somewhere else if they have the capability of interstellar travel? So I seriously have thought about is, could Earth have been populated from somewhere else in the galaxy, and it took them 3,000 years to get here? How did they get the people here? Was it multi-generation? There's stories on that. Heinlein's got a great one on that, but I can't remember right now. But um, you forget why you were even coming.
Yeah. That's always an interest, especially with a story wise, but also very realistic as well. Even if you kept alive the story of why you were coming, eventually it is just a story, which becomes a fairy tale mythology. And I guess in some
Could be
ways it
Noah's
almost
Ark.
reminds me of Battlestar Galactica in a way. They had this sort of mythological Earth that they were searching
Mm-hmm.
for. Um, but yeah, then you have the idea of the future generations just deciding, well, why the heck do we want to even go there? Like, we're happy here, right? That's all these kind of issues. Yeah. Um, and that leads us to sort of final question then. There are those who would say we shouldn't settle other worlds because of the damage we might do to indigenous life forms. And that includes up to even things like bacteria on relatively barren worlds. So what would your thoughts be on this? Should we go out? Should we not go out? Should we just send robot probes?
Okay. I think I've got a more utilitarian uh, line of thought than the values driven. I mean, I see that here where special interest groups say, no, you can't build that dam because it'll negatively impact this roach. And it's been to that degree. Uh, there's got to be a balance somewhere in between. I think we should be out exploring. I think the AI robotic models, although disappointing from an adventurous perspective, are clearly a wise approach to investigation. But whether or not we would inhabit another planet, would we be imperialist Earth going out and saying, okay, well, anything that looks good and we can breathe on, we're going to take. I wish we would advance beyond that, where we can get into a balanced approach to exploring the universe. But I haven't seen it yet. So we're 2 generations away from being able to do that if we can.
Yeah, because one of the points I think I bring up in this kind of scenario is like if we're Federation, Star Trek Federation, for example, we have like the advanced, then you can say, all right, we have a prime directive, we have the technology, we can fly wherever we want, so we can leave certain cultures that are developing alone. But if you're launching out into the galaxy for the first time, and every single stop you make is life or death for you, and you need the resources to survive, I think that's going to dictate an entirely different behavior towards whatever indigenous life is found, isn't it? And I'm not saying that we shouldn't go. Definitely, I'm a person that believes we should go. I just think that you know we could try to behave by like a prime directive, but when the reality is when your survival's on the line, it's kind of goes out the window, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think for survival, it goes that way, and that's who we are. Which goes back to your question earlier. If they're out there, why aren't they talking to us? Well, from our perspective, well, we always want more. We always need more. And if we can go there and go to your world and get it, then I think if they're advanced enough to visit us, they're probably advanced enough to know that once we get the technology, we would be a danger to them.
Do you think it would be an unknown? I kind of, well, we don't have any evidence either way to how other species would have, let's say, evolved, and what characteristics they'd have. My own feeling is that they're going to have similar characteristics, just like sort of all animals on the planet, well, on our planet. So do you think like they would yeah, they would be concerned that we might be a danger to them, but also they could be proactive as well, couldn't they? I mean, and obviously both of these possibilities are discussed in many science fiction stories.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's, I mean,
I don't
I'm
know.
just, I guess I'm just challenging the idea that um
Here's a fun question for you. Here's a fun question for you.
no,
Who
no, it's
would
my
you introduce?
podcast. You don't get that? No, I'm joking.
Who would you introduce yourself to if you were an alien coming, decided to introduce yourself to our population on the Earth?
Yeah, I suppose that would depend on what kind of ship I'm bringing with me and how many guns it has.
I guess
Yeah,
Switzerland.
Switzerland, yeah. Yeah, no, I mean it's a valid question. You would have to come, I think, with an excess of strength. Hopefully not willing to use it. I mean, from our perspective, but I think you wouldn't want to come as sort of a passive visitor, would you? You'd be pretty scared, I think.
Yeah, they might want to dissect me.
Yeah, exactly. There's have you seen the movie Paul?
I have not.
Okay, it's a pretty good one. It's two yeah, it's a British movie, but who's it? Simon Pegg, I think. And yeah, they're basically effectively they end up rescuing or helping an alien who's been in, let's say, Area 51 for like 50 years, and then it's
Mm-hmm.
just realized that they're about to dissect him. So so he's made an escape trying to get back home. It's quite good,
Remember,
actually. Yeah.
remember the Farscape episode where Crichton and his friends came to Earth. They were going to dissect. Which one did they have on the dissecting table? I can't remember. It's been a while since I watched it, but I always remember thinking about that when they did that episode. They were on Earth and they captured the aliens who were in Farscape, and now they're going to dissect them to see what they're made of.
Do you think that's I don't know, I was thinking because we were always worried about aliens dissecting us or probing us and stuff like this, weird things, right? Do you think that's sort of a parallel fear in a way? Are we afraid of that they're doing that to us because we know we do that to them, kind of thing?
Well, I really wonder if they were clearly intelligent life. I don't know if we would do that to them unless if they were dead. Obviously, we would.
Mm.
But if they were living, I don't know. I maybe I have too much. Oh boy, how could I have too much faith?
Yeah, I mean,
I
you'd
would
hope
like
that.
to. I would like to think even today, the people of Earth in the many civilized countries wouldn't dissect a living alien who came in peace. I hope not, but I don't know.
Yeah, you would hope. I'm with you. You definitely hope not. But then you look at everything that's going on underneath the covers, behind the scenes that we don't know about, and you're like, I don't know if I have so much faith in that perspective. On that note, unless you had something more positive to add, so I think we should wrap it up. It's been great chatting with you. Before we go, perhaps you can tell us what plans you might have for upcoming books, where we could go to find you online, and if you'll be in any upcoming events.
We brought up a question earlier that I'm a little concerned about. Is I have finished the manuscript for Salt of the Earth, and I am going to get that one out shortly, maybe by Christmas. But it actually takes a very practical look. It's a much more adult book, but it takes a practical look at asteroid mining
Oh, okay.
and the challenges and how you get there. And probably going to be a Charles Dickens type slow get into it book because it takes a while to get into. They're actually leaving the planet because you don't instantly have a spaceship.
Yeah.
And it has a lot of political flavor to it that as opposed to this one, which is really a fun adventure. That one also has an adventure. It's also positive, but it also has a lot of Earth's warts, uh, as barriers into it, everything from conspiracy to organized crime. So Salt of the Earth, that would be, if you like a more adult book, that should be out, and I'm very happy with it. I think it's the best thing I've written. And there's another one, Project Lilliput, which is where science and the human needs get to a point where they have to take one over the other. So politics wins, and they miniaturize the entire animal kingdom, including humans. Except they run into a minor problem, which is cockroaches don't shrink. Birds and snakes return to their same size in 3 or 4 generations. So that's more of a young adult or a middle school adventure story. But
yeah, it sounds fun. And where could we find you online then?
I do have a website now, orionspur.com. No hyphens, 2 S's, Orion's Spur. Orion's with the hyphens, Spur is where I am on Facebook. I am on Instagram. What is that? I think that's all one word, Orion Spur 52. So that's how you can find me.
Alan Doc Hansen, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's been fun talking with you. Have a great day.
And thank you for listening. Information and links related to this and all episodes are available at alternatefutures.co.uk. I'm also over at Substack under Alternate Futures, where I post articles on science fiction, socio-technological issues, and futurism. You can subscribe for free or sign up for a paid account if you'd like to support the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, why not share it with friends, writers, and other sci-fi fans you know? And if there are any indie sci-fi creators you'd like to see featured, send me a message at podcast@alternatefutures.co.uk. Once again, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you'll join me on the next episode.
This is the future. Human error. Evolution. This is the future.